It was a crisp autumn afternoon when life as Jennifer Cooper knew it changed forever. Her 8-year-old son Ethan was doing what he loved most, playing soccer with his friends during the school's weekly match. Jenny watched from the sidelines, cheering him on like any other ordinary day. But fate had different plans. No one could have predicted that Ethan's sudden collapse on the field would mark the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything they believed about life, death, and a mother's intuition. As the ambulance sirens wailed and medical teams rushed to pronounce her son dead from an apparent heart failure, Jenny couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. Little did she know, her maternal instincts would soon lead her down a path that would defy all logic and medical science. The funeral home's white walls seemed to close in around Jenny as she sat in the consultation room, mechanically nodding at burial options she never thought she'd have to consider for her 8-year-old son. The mahogany casket before her, perfect for a child, the funeral director had said with practiced sympathy, made her stomach turn. Perfect? How could anything about burying your child be perfect? The days following Ethan's collapse blurred together in a haze of disbelief. Friends and family moved through her house like shadows, their consoling words bouncing off her like echoes in an empty room. Rachel, her sister, had taken charge of the arrangements, fielding calls and coordinating with the school about the memorial service. Jenny could only stare at Ethan's soccer cleats, still mud-stained from his last game, sitting untouched by the door where he'd left them. The night before the funeral, Jenny found herself in Ethan's room, surrounded by the vibrant evidence of a life barely begun. Superhero posters covered the walls, and a half-finished Lego spaceship sat on his desk, a project they were supposed to complete that weekend. His backpack leaned against the bed, homework still tucked inside, waiting for a Monday morning that would never come. The reality of it all crashed over her like a tidal wave. She picked up his favorite stuffed dinosaur, the one he'd insisted he was too old for, but still secretly slept with. The fabric was worn smooth from years of love, and as she held it to her chest, his scent, a mixture of grass, bubble gum, and that indefinable essence that was purely Ethan, enveloped her. The dam finally broke. Jenny collapsed onto his bed, her body racked with sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. Outside, the neighborhood settled into its nightly routine. She could hear children playing, dogs barking, cars pulling into driveways, the normal sounds of life continuing impossibly onward. How could the world keep turning when her entire universe had stopped? The sun would rise tomorrow, and she would have to put on a black dress and watch them lower her baby into the ground. The thought made her physically ill. That night, as she finally drifted into an exhausted sleep in Ethan's bed, clutching his dinosaur, something shifted in the atmosphere. Perhaps it was the way the moonlight cast unusual shadows through his window, or how the night air seemed to whisper through the room. But Jenny's dreams that night would be anything but ordinary, and though she didn't know it yet, these dreams would be the first hint that something was terribly, incredibly wrong with the reality she'd been forced to accept. The first dream came 3 days after the funeral. Jenny had finally managed to fall asleep in her own bed, though Ethan's dinosaur still lay clutched in her arms. In the dream, she was standing in a vast, dark space, and through the darkness came Ethan's voice, clear as a bell. "Mum, I'm cold. Why is it so dark?" The desperation in his voice made her bolt upright in bed, her heart thundering against her ribs, her nightgown soaked with sweat. She tried to dismiss it as her grief playing tricks on her mind, but the dreams continued, each more vivid than the last. In one, she saw Ethan banging on a dark surface above him, his small fists pounding desperately. In another, she felt his fear as if it were her own, the suffocating sensation of being trapped in a confined space. She would wake up gasping for air, her maternal instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. During her waking hours, strange coincidences began to pile up. The wind chime Ethan had made in art class suddenly started ringing on perfectly still days. His favorite song would play randomly on the radio at significant moments. Once, while sorting through his belongings, a task that felt like peeling off her own skin. She found his science journal open to a page about catalepsy, a rare condition he'd been researching for a school project. The words seemed to jump off the page at her. Late at night, when the house was quiet except for the hollow tick of the clock, Jenny found herself diving deep into internet searches. Cases of people wrongly pronounced dead, she typed with trembling fingers. Signs of catalepsy. Children waking up after death. Each article she read sent chills down her spine. Stories of people awakening in morgues, medical mistakes discovered too late, rare conditions that mimicked death. She began keeping a journal of her dreams and the coincidences, trying to convince herself she wasn't losing her mind. Rachel noticed the changes in her sister. The hollow-eyed grief was being replaced by something else, a feverish intensity that worried her. "Jenny," she said gently one evening, finding her sister once again hunched over her laptop. "I'm concerned about you. This isn't healthy. Maybe you should talk to someone." But how could Jenny explain what she was feeling? How could she put into words the bone-deep certainty that was growing stronger with each passing day? The dreams weren't just dreams, they were messages. Every cell in her body hummed with a terrible truth that she couldn't ignore. Ethan was trying to reach her. 1 week after the funeral, Jenny woke from the most vivid dream yet. In it, Ethan had spoken directly to her, his voice clear and urgent. "Mommy, please hurry. There's not much time." When she opened her eyes, her arms still reaching out for him, she found Ethan's dinosaur lying on the floor, though she distinctly remembered placing it on her bedside table the night before. As she picked it up, a strange resolve began to crystallize in her mind. She knew what she had to do, even if it meant everyone would think she had lost her mind. After all, wasn't that what motherhood was about? Trusting your instincts, no matter how impossible they seemed? The dreams had become unbearable, no longer mere fragments of grief. They now carried a weight that pressed against Jenny's consciousness even during her waking hours. Each night, Ethan's voice grew more desperate, more real. "Time is running out," he would whisper, the words echoing in the darkness of her mind. She finally broke down and confided in Rachel during a rain-soaked evening. Her sister listened in growing concern as Jenny described the dreams, the signs, the inexplicable feelings that kept her awake at night. When she mentioned her growing suspicion about catalepsy, Rachel's face paled. "Jenny, honey, I know you're hurting, but this..." Rachel's voice trailed off as she watched her sister pull out a folder filled with research papers and medical case studies. "Look at this." Jenny's hands trembled as she spread the documents across the kitchen table. "There are documented cases, Rachel. People declared dead only to wake up hours, sometimes days later. What if the doctors made a mistake? What if..." "Stop!" Rachel grabbed her sister's hands. "You need to stop this. Ethan is gone, Jenny. I can't watch you torture yourself like this." But that night, as thunder rolled outside her window, something changed. The dream came with a clarity she had never experienced before. She saw Ethan, felt his presence as real as the rain beating against the glass. He wasn't just calling out this time. He was showing her something. Numbers, a location, specific details that burned into her memory. When she woke, her decision was made. The world could call her crazy, but a mother's intuition screamed louder than reason. She knew what she had to do, even if it meant facing the unthinkable. Tomorrow night, she would act on her conviction, regardless of the consequences. Looking at Ethan's photo on her nightstand, Jenny whispered into the darkness, "Hold on, baby. Mommy's coming." The cemetery at midnight was a different world. Moonlight cast long shadows across the granite headstones, and the autumn wind whispered through the trees like distant voices. Jenny's hands shook as she parked her car in the darkest corner of the grounds, the shovel and crowbar hidden under a black tarp in her trunk, feeling like burning evidence of her desperation. She had planned everything meticulously. The night watchman's routine, memorized over 3 nights of careful observation, the exact location of Ethan's grave, just hidden enough by a cluster of old oak trees, the tools needed for what she was about to do. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the reality of this moment. "I must be insane," she whispered to herself, her breath visible in the cold night air. But then Ethan's voice echoed in her mind. "Mommy, please hurry." And her resolve hardened like steel. With trembling fingers, she checked her phone one last time. No signal. She was truly alone. The first shovel of dirt felt like sacrilege. Each subsequent scoop grew heavier, her arms burning with effort, but she couldn't stop. Sweat soaked through her dark clothes despite the cold, and her quiet sobs mixed with the rhythmic sound of digging. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, marked only by the distant church bells striking 1, then 2 in the morning. When her shovel finally struck something solid, Jenny's heart nearly stopped. The hollow sound of metal against wood echoed in the stillness. Her movements became frantic as she cleared the remaining dirt from around the casket. The crowbar felt impossibly heavy in her hands as she positioned it at the edge of the lid. A sudden beam of light cut through the darkness. "Hey! Who's there?" The night watchman's voice carried across the cemetery. Jenny's blood turned to ice, but she couldn't stop now. Not when she was so close. With strength she didn't know she possessed, she wrenched at the casket lid. The wood creaked in protest, and then the world stopped. Because there, in the pale moonlight, she saw something that would forever change everything she thought she knew about reality. A sight that would justify every wild instinct that had led her to this unthinkable moment. Ethan's chest was moving. Time crystallized into a single moment. Ethan's chest rose and fell, barely perceptible, but unmistakably there. The flashlight beam drew closer, and Jenny's maternal instincts took over. In one fluid motion, she gathered her son's cold body into her arms, his skin like ice against hers. "Stop right there!" The guard's voice boomed across the cemetery. Jenny ran. Her muscles screamed in protest as she carried Ethan, his body lighter than she remembered, yet somehow impossibly heavy. The beam of light danced wildly behind her as shouts echoed through the night. Her car seemed miles away. "He's alive!" she gasped into her phone as she drove, breaking every speed limit. Rachel's sleep-addled voice turned to sharp alertness. "Jenny, what? Meet me at Memorial Hospital. Call Dr. Martinez, the one from the news article about catalepsy. Now, Rachel." Ethan remained motionless in the back seat, wrapped in her coat. Every red light felt like an eternity. Every glance in the rearview mirror showed flashing lights. Police or her imagination, she couldn't tell. The hospital's emergency entrance blazed like a beacon. As medical staff swarmed around them, Jenny caught fragments of their shocked exclamations. "Impossible, core temperature, cataleptic state, get him into trauma 1. As they wheeled Ethan away, Jenny collapsed against the wall, her dirt-stained hands trembling. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Now came the hardest part, waiting to see if she'd been in time. Behind her, police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The next 48 hours became a blur of beeping, monitors, and hushed medical consultations. Ethan lay in the ICU, a maze of tubes and wires, connecting him to machines that tracked every flutter of life in his fragile body. The doctors spoke in cautious terms, words like unprecedented and miraculous, mixed with critical condition and organ failure risk. Dr. Martinez arrived from Boston at dawn, his expertise in catalepsy cases making him their only hope. "The next 24 hours are crucial," he stated, his eyes grave. "His body is fighting to restart systems that have been dormant. It's like rebooting a complex machine. Anything could go wrong." The police questioned Jenny between her anxious vigils at Ethan's bedside. Grave desecration charges loomed over her, but she barely registered their threats. Her entire world had narrowed to the rhythmic rise and fall of her son's chest and the stuttering beep of his heart monitor. Then, just as hope began to flicker, Ethan's vitals plummeted. Alarms screamed through the ICU. Medical staff rushed in as Jenny was pulled away, her son's life hanging by an increasingly fragile thread. "We're losing him!" someone shouted. "Get the crash cart!" The sound of the flatline pierced the air. The hospital corridor erupted into chaos. As doctors fought to restart Ethan's heart, the media storm that had been brewing finally broke. News vans swarmed the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal flowers. The story had leaked. A mother's impossible intuition, a miraculous rescue, and now a life hanging in the balance. The hospital administration faced a barrage of questions. How had they missed the signs of catalepsy? The chief of medicine, Dr. Thompson, stood before a wall of microphones, his face ashen. "We're launching a full investigation into our death certification procedures," he announced, his voice trembling. "If we made a mistake inside the ICU, none of that mattered." For 3 minutes and 42 seconds, Ethan's heart refused to beat. Jenny pressed against the observation window, her hands leaving smudges on the glass as she whispered desperate prayers. Dr. Martinez worked with mechanical precision, his team moving in choreographed urgency around Ethan's bed. "Clear!" Another shock. Nothing. The police officers who had come to arrest Jenny stood frozen in the hallway, their handcuffs forgotten as the drama unfolded. Rachel gripped her sister's shoulders, both of them shaking. "Clear!" a third time. The world seemed to hold its breath, then impossibly a beep, weak at first, then stronger. Ethan's heart had started fighting back. "Got him!" Dr. Martinez's voice cracked with emotion. "He's stabilizing!" Jenny collapsed to her knees as television cameras caught the moment through the hospital windows. By morning, their story would captivate the nation. Medical boards would convene emergency sessions. Legal experts would debate the implications. But in that moment, all that existed was the steady rhythm of her son's returning heartbeat, growing stronger with each passing second. Outside the hospital room, a detective quietly pocketed his handcuffs and nodded to his partner. They slipped away without a word, leaving behind the arrest warrant that would never be served. Some laws, they silently agreed, were meant to bow before a mother's love. When Ethan's eyes fluttered open hours later, the first thing he saw was his mother's tear-stained face. "You heard me," he whispered, his voice raspy. "In the dark. You heard me calling." The media called it the miracle at Memorial Hospital. The medical community called it a wake-up call for review of death certification protocols. But Jenny called it what it truly was: vindication of a mother's intuition, proof that some bonds transcend the boundaries between life and death. As dawn broke over the hospital, reporters gathered to tell a story that would challenge everything modern medicine thought it knew about death, life, and the power of a mother's love. The road to recovery twisted through unexpected territories. In the quiet moments between physical therapy sessions, Ethan would describe fragments of his time in darkness, sensations of being trapped, hearing distant voices, and somehow always knowing his mother was coming for him. Each word validated Jenny's decision, though the nightmares still haunted her sleep. The hospital became their temporary home. Ethan's room transformed from a sterile medical space into a sanctuary of healing, its walls soon covered with drawings from his classmates and letters from families who'd heard their story. Each small victory, the first independent breath, the first steps, the first smile, felt like a miracle all over again. Jenny faced her own battles. The trauma of those 8 days left invisible scars. She'd wake in cold sweats, her hands instinctively reaching for her son. Dr. Wilson, the hospital's psychiatrist, helped her navigate through the maze of PTSD and anxiety. "You saved your son," he reminded her during their sessions, "but now you need to save yourself too." Their story sparked a movement. Medical schools began incorporating Jenny's case into their curriculum, teaching future doctors about the complex intersection of maternal, intuition, and medical science. Legal reforms were proposed to protect parents who acted on similar instincts. But for Jenny and Ethan, the most profound changes were deeply personal. "I can still feel it sometimes," Ethan confided one evening, his voice stronger but carrying a new wisdom beyond his years. "How much you love me. It was the only warm thing in the dark." As autumn turned to winter, mother and son learned to piece themselves back together, knowing they'd never be quite the same, but perhaps becoming something stronger in their broken places. 5 years later, Ethan Cooper stood at the podium of his middle school science fair, his project titled The Science of Intuition, When Medicine Meets Maternal Instinct. At 13, he'd grown into a thoughtful teenager with a passionate interest in neuroscience and consciousness studies. In the ED2 audience, Jenny watched with tears in her eyes, remembering how close she'd come to losing this moment forever. Their story had become legend in the medical community. 3 major hospitals had revised their death certification protocols, and Jenny had been invited to speak at medical conferences about the importance of listening to family members' instincts. But more importantly, their experience had touched countless lives, giving hope to families facing their own impossible battles. "My mom didn't just save my life," Ethan concluded his presentation, his voice strong and clear. "She showed the world that sometimes the most powerful force isn't science or medicine, it's love." That evening, as mother and son walked through their favorite park, Ethan reached for Jenny's hand, something his teenage self rarely did anymore. "You know what I remember most from the dark?" he asked quietly. "Your voice, telling me to hold on. And I knew, somehow, that you'd move heaven and earth to reach me." Jenny squeezed his hand, knowing that their story would continue to inspire others, proving that a mother's love could indeed transcend the boundaries between life and death. If this story touched your heart, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that challenge our understanding of life, love, and the bonds that connect us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced a moment when intuition proved stronger than logic? Your story could inspire others who need to hear it today.